Welcome. My name is James Stone, and I am been working on salmon and water policy issues out of Southern California for over the last decade, representing NorCal Guides and Sportsmen's Association. Best way to support us as a nonprofit 501c3 is just to go to ncgasa.org and support us for $30 or any dollar amount that you want. It's a full tax deduction write-off, and it goes to fight for the future for your kids and grandkids and to bring this education. So here we go. All right. A lot of new information is kind of out, and it's, want to make sure that I'm getting all of that information to you. So I'm not going to give you exact numbers, specifically like to the number. So these numbers that you hear today, I want you to be understanding that these are not the identical numbers, because I can't give those to you because they haven't been published yet. And when those numbers get published, will be about another week, and we'll see the review for ocean fisheries. You'll be able to find that document on pcouncil.org, and the Pacific Fisheries Management Council, who regulate the ocean season and harvest for salmon and other species, will put out that document in about next week, and then you'll have the identical pinpoint numbers, but you'll see that they are very, 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 very close to what I'm going to give you today. So therefore, and then after that, we will see moving forward on February 26th, there will be a salmon information meeting held by California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And that will be when they give you all of these numbers for 2024, and they tell you all the future for 2025. And then you give your input as members of the public on what you would like to see moving forward into the 2025 season. Whether you think that we should have a season, whether you don't, all of that, all that public comment. Last year, we weren't able to make public comment. They didn't give us a chance. The state of California cut us off on the live Zoom and said there was no opportunity for public comment for the first time since I've ever been attending these meetings. But here we go. So a lot of information out there. All right, so let's start. 2024, we had a full salmon closure. It was the second time that we have had a full closure across the entire coast, back-to-back years. We were fully closed in all of 2023. There was no salmon fishing for Chinook salmon in all of California in 23 and all of Oregon in 23. The reason that Oregon got shut down in 2023 was because a lot of our Sacramento and featherfish travel all the way up to the coastline. And typically they stay south of Cape Falcon. And they're in the area of the Oregon coast. They swim up, then they come back down through Coos Bay, and they swim back down through the Oregon coast, through the California coast, and then back through the Golden Gate, and then come up the Sacramento and Feather Rivers. Generally, that's kind of how your sac and your feather stocks of salmon swim. Now, that's fall run that I'm talking about, fall run. That's the only species that we literally can catch right now is fall run and late fall run. And this is going to be a huge education for any of you that are out there right now. I know that we've had over 1,000 comments from a lot of Southern Californian interest on water on some of our posts in the last week. And so if you're from Southern California, I really want you to stay on and get this education about the difference in the distinct salmon runs, because you need to understand what salmon run is affecting your water policies. And it's not the fall run, and that's the species that I'm talking about, swimming up into Oregon and back down. And so they closed the entire salmon season in 2023, California and Oregon, and they said that there was 165,000 fish that were swimming out in the ocean. And the industry said, we don't believe that. The model has been off year after year after year, 31% modeling error year after year, all the way till 23. And the season was shut down, and the industry was correct. And the actual number that the state reported back returning was 133,000. Now, a lot of people believe that that number was actually inflated and that there was less than that. But the minimum required, according to the Fisheries Management Plan, as of 1984, is 122,000, and that's called the SMSY, and that's the minimum that's the minimum allowable stock to come back to provide the yield necessary for 3 years moving on, so that there can be a fishery and healthy escapement. So that was 2023. So we were off with no fishing in California and Oregon for Chinook salmon. It was off 21%, the model. Now we come into 2024, and last year in March in Fresno, the council met and they said that the estimate was 213,000 this past year. They said there's 213,000 fish that are out there. And so the federal government said we need at least 180,000 of those 280 to come home to provide for the resource and to provide for spawning. And so therefore, we want to see 180,000. That's what the federal government said. NIMS, NOAA Fisheries. That's Department of Commerce, everyone, so that you know. And so the Department of Commerce told the council members that they had to have 180,000 fish home. So looking at 213,000 minus 180,000, that only leaves 33,000 fish total to be harvested. Well, the ocean harvest model, the way that works is that as soon as you required to send 180,000 home, whatever that number is, minimum 122, upwards of 180 on the high end since 1984. If the federal government says that it's got to stay at the high end at the 180,000, then you would tack a small amount, 14% on top of that, which would be about 25,400 fish, or 25,200 fish, and you would throw that on top of the 180 for in-river harvest. That is the average historical amount of fish that are harvested in river. It's 14% of the escapement on top, which would give you a river run size of about 205,000. And that's the way that always works. However, this past year, the river allocation was removed from the model for only the second time in history. The first time it happened was 2018. And it's what caused me and my board to go sit on the council. And we sat on this council from 2019 for almost 6 full years. And then last year, they again removed the river allocation and put it into the general allocation for the ocean for only the second time in the history since 1984. And I got very upset as well, as because that river allocation was for the river and not for ocean harvest. And that's when I made some comments, and I'll just leave it at that. And then I was terminated and kicked off of that committee by April, after serving for 6 years as a volunteer, representing all of you and all of my membership and all of the people that fish for salmon and care about water. And so now I'm just a member of the public. And so I would be just like you and me, just going and attending these meetings. And they gave the position that I originally sat on for 5.5 years, was now given to another ocean group. And so we now, on that committee, we have 0 representation in the state of California for inland. But to be perfectly fair, there's 0 representation for Oregon, Washington, on that council as well. The only representation for inland fisheries on that council, Salmon Advisory Subpanel, is for Idaho. Now, the Pacific Fisheries Management Council Salmon Advisory Subpanel represents those 4 states: California, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And Idaho has an inland representative because obviously they don't have an ocean fishery. But Washington, Oregon, and California have always only had 3 seats on that. They've had a commercial seat, a charter boat seat, and a sports seat. For the first time ever, California designed a brand new seat for me to sit on in 2019. And so California had 4 seats from 2019 moving forward. And then once I was terminated, we thought that seat would then either go to another inland representative or it would be dissolved. But that's not the case. That seat was retained and given to another ocean representative. And so now we don't have any inland representation. And so this is my job to make sure that I'm giving you all of the information so that you can make your public comments on behalf of inland and ocean and commercial throughout. So 2024, they said there was 213,000 fish, and they said, well, we're going to try to move the river allocation into the ocean and try to harvest these 33,000. And individuals did as much as they could to try to get access to those 33,000, and it came down to law enforcement division was not going to be able to open an ocean fishery and try to control 100,000 plus salmon anglers going out over, the entire coast of California over a 3-day opener, which would have been the only thing that they think that they could have done last year. And so The state of California came forward and said that we need to close this fishery because we can't monitor it and we can't control it. And so they closed it. And they said the good news is that we're going to get 213,000 fish home in the Sacramento, Feather, American, and Yuba rivers. That's the Sacramento Index. So when you hear me say Sacramento Index, SI, that is the SI is, what is the SI? That's the preseason forecast of whatever it is. And then we go fishing in the ocean, commercial and recreation. And then we go fishing inland. And then there's escapement, when that's the final number, that has to be a minimum of 122,000. Now, the federal government, as I told you, said that needed to be 180 because we're constantly missing the 122,000 on the fall run. We're only talking fall run salmon right now, ladies and gentlemen, fall run salmon. And so the season got closed. And so last year, the fish came home. No fishing in the state of California. There was a small fishery in Oregon. I'm told that Oregon commercial and recreational fisheries harvested right around 20,000 total Chinook in the entire state of Oregon out in the ocean. So there was a total of like 19 to 20,000 Chinook harvested in Oregon. We have not seen what piece of that puzzle was California stocks. So some of those fish would be Klamath stock, Trinity stock, and some of those would be Sacramento stock, and some of those would be San Joaquin stock, which are the McCollum hatchery. That's the only hatchery really producing a lot of salmon out of the San Joaquin. So we'll talk about that here in a moment, but I'm just trying to make sure everyone's up to speed. So fall run salmon closed in California, and they said these 213,000 would now come home. Well, the numbers are out, and unfortunately, we did not even make the minimum of 122,000. In fact, it's going to be much worse than that. It is devastating on how few fish came home this last year. It's another collapse. It's another year that we failed to make the minimum escapement. And it's another year to where I have testified in front of this body for 6-7 years now, testifying, showing the empirical data, showing the science, showing their information directly to them, and they're not listening to it. And they're avoiding it because they are either have an agenda or they're trying to create an opportunity of fishing when it's not there at times, at least in 23 and 24. And so therefore, again, it's going to be, rewarding to look the last 4 years, a dumb fishing guide, semi-retired fishing guide that has been forced to retire because there are no salmon anymore and haven't been any salmon in our rivers since 2020, that now I'm required to kind of tell them this data and present this data. And every single year since 2020, including 2020, I have called the escapement, the final number after fishing in 2020 and 2021. I said, here's what the number is going to be. And I was dead on. 2022, I said, we're going to miss the 122,000 escapement. They said, there's no way. And we did a little bit too much harvesting out in the ocean, but again, because the models were inaccurate and gave us false information. And so we missed escapement. Only 61,845 fish came back in 22. That was the final nail in the coffin. And I think that we were in utter collapse. And now in 23, as I mentioned, 133,000 no fishing in California and Oregon. And now this year, going to be below about 100,000 fish. It's going to be terrible. And that's what you're going to hear here in a couple of, next week. You'll see it, the document come out, review of ocean fisheries, and it's going to say that we're below 100,000 fish. So it's just terrible news. Again, this model has, been so inaccurate year after year after year. It's just constantly inaccurate. And I don't know why we continue to fail to look at trying to revisit this, or at least put a buffer on those stocks so that we make sure we get our fish home. Now, a lot of the guys in the ocean will say, hey, it's really hard to want to send more fish home in the model. Paper fish, we call them. I know the scientists don't like that term, but we call them paper fish when we're working within the models that the government gives us so that we can set our seasons. And when we take those paper fish and we move them around according to try to gain access and opportunity, it's very difficult because we have constraining factors. So Those constraining factors I'll be mentioning here in a little bit are the Klamath fish, as well as the coastal Chinook, which are listed through the Endangered Species Act and California Endangered Species Act, as well as the winter run salmon on the Sacramento River at a Redding that have been listed on the Endangered Species Act and California Endangered Species Act since 1989. The winter run salmon is the salmon that affects your water diversions everywhere in California. So if you're a farmer on this call right now, or you're a municipality on this call, or you're trying to understand, why haven't I got water in certain years that I want to get waters, and they said they needed to give water to fish? Well, the Endangered Species Act and the California Endangered Species Act requires for the state and federal government through their projects, the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project Improvement Act that started in 1992, and the State Water Project that started in the 60s when they built Orville, was designed to give water, move water from the north to the south in certain areas. And when I say south, it was only designed to really move it above the grapevine. That was the original intention, was to move water to like Fresno, Kern County, San Joaquin County, and some others. And the state was going to try to provide some water over the top of the grapevine through Metropolitan Water District. And they do, through the state. Now, we'll get into the water policy here in a moment, everybody, and you're going to get really interested in this because there's a lot of misinformation out there on the news, even on the top podcast, even on all the top stuff. I'm hearing a lot of stuff that just does not make sense, what people are saying. And so people think they understand the system, and there's a lot of misinformation out there. So getting back to salmon, and then I'm going to go right into the water season, and then we'll get back into more about salmon. Your water is affected most by the ESA listed species. And so I'm going to start by saying, what are those ESA listed species? You have the Delta smelt, which a lot of you know, which is a very, very small little fish like this that has been showing up as none left and practically extinct for the last number of years. There's been very few fish showing up in any of the trawl surveys or anything else. And so there is water that is allocated to those fish, as well as Livingston Stone Hatchery up in under Shasta Dam is growing some smelt as well as winter run salmon that are listed on the ESA. Then you also have spring run salmon, which are listed under the ESA and CESA. And then on top of that, you also have the green sturgeon that is listed on the ESA back in 2006 and 7. Now, there's also a live petition right now that has been put out there for white sturgeon, which is the other sturgeon, which our organization was fighting against and trying to fight for fishing opportunity and to keep everyone on the water. Unfortunately, there was 4 groups that came out. You can look it all up yourself. I don't have to mention who they are, but you can go look it up. There are 4 groups that filed a state and federal petition to shut us down from fishing for white sturgeon. And a lot of you might say, well, why would they do that? Well, they claim that the species is in distress and collapsed and not going to come back. And since sturgeon takes so long to grow, they were advocating that it needed to be shut down. Well, they did shut it down through the Fish and Game Commission, and it went to complete closure. And then our organization fought to get it reopened. We filed a petition for regulatory change through the commission to get sturgeon reopened for catch and release as these listing petitions that were brought forth by these 4 groups out of the Delta and the Bay Area to list the sturgeon. And so they are going to be reviewing all that information over the next year, and we should hear something between the months of August and next February is my guess, when we will see data coming back, and we will see the Fish and Game Commission make their final decision in the state on whether it will be listed. And then the federal government will then come back with their listing, which now that you have a new administration, you might see a completely different response from the ESA than you were expecting from the previous administration. So whenever you have a Democratic administration in the federal policy, you generally will see a lot more safeguards put in place, a lot more conservation put in place, and a lot more regulatory language put into place to protect the species and to prevent any contact with that species. When you have a more Republican administration, you will see a lot less constraints. You will normally see other areas to where that administration might say, let's try to do this, that, and that, instead of reduce access or fishing. You might also see some administrations in Republican administrations actually list and be more conservative if they are conservation based. So it just depends. But last time, when you saw the Trump administration in, you had Secretary Bernhardt in for the Department of Interior, which runs the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, which is running Shasta Dam and Folsom Dam. And they were not doing the most protective measures in the past. But just because you're a D or an R does not make any difference of whether or not it's an automatic, whether you protect fish or you don't. So I want that to be clear right out of the gate. That doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum we are. Throw that all out, folks. Use common sense here, and use common sense of what is the point? What are they trying to do? What are the objectives, and why would they do this, or why would they not? Well, when a fish is listed under the Endangered Species Act and the Federal Endangered Species Act, then it gives control to the people that are listing in order for them to control the amount of impacts, like I said. So can you harvest them? No. Okay. Or how much can you possibly contact them without shutting down a season where we are targeting the fall run, the only fish that we are left to fish? Prior to 1989, we would go out into the ocean for 10 months a year and fish for 10 full months and catch spring run, winter run, fall run, late fall run. It didn't. The phone just went out, so sorry about that. If I do get a glitch, it's because of all the weather and the storm. I'll come right back on, and for some reason I do disconnect, I will also start an additional second live video immediately, just so that you all know. So when that ESA came out, that is what dictates your access to that fishery. Sorry, we're getting pauses, you guys. I'm sorry, because of the weather and the wind and everything. Now, inland, you're never given any opportunity to contact those fish. We've been shut out completely. So as I mentioned, in the ocean used to be a 10-month season. It's now been truncated all the way down to like a 4 or 5 month season if you're lucky on fall run now. As I mentioned, the last 2 years, we've been fully closed. But for winter run inland, we lost all of our time. That was the fishing that was allowed to be done in January and inland. And that's when those fish start to come in. And so we've lost all opportunity on those fish back in 1989. Then we used to fish in February and March and April into May for the spring run, specifically on the Feather River, where we have a hatchery under the State Water Project that was designed to mitigate the losses of Orville Dam and to raise spring run and fall run salmon at that hatchery, which they've been doing every year. But in 2007, somebody listed them. So they put an ESA and CESA, California Endangered Species Act, and Federal Endangered Species Act listing on them. And now we're not allowed to fish for them anymore. And in the ocean, if you catch one, it counts against you. So therefore, we have been curtailed and shut down on almost every single fishery when it comes to salmon in the state of California in the last 35 years. We've lost opportunity. We've lost rivers. We've lost access. I can't count the amount of rivers on the coast that there's no salmon in anymore to fish for, but many of them have just been belly up and gone due to many different things. There's many different types of practices and water demands that go from agricultural diversions, that go from timber, that go from mining, and that goes from, drought operations as well. And then again, the lack of mitigating, right? Like take the Eel River, for example. There's no hatchery there. And so therefore you're not getting a boost of fish coming back to the system like you do in the Central Valley. So I'm going to kind of stop there for 1 minute, and then I'm going to get into the hatcheries next. I'm going to tell you what came back to each hatchery. Coleman on the Sacramento River, Battle Creek in Anderson, California, right below Keswick and Shasta Dam. I'm going to give you that answer. Then I'll go to the Feather. Then I'll go to the American. Then I'll go to the McCollum. We'll talk those. I'm going to talk the Klamath Trinity real fast. And then I'm going to get into water policy about how this whole thing is working. And then I'm going to get some more questions. But let me get some questions real quick. and then we'll get right into the hatcheries and then back into the water. So here we go. Thank you, everybody. 123 of you right now and still going and climbing. Thank you. We got another glitch there because people are calling me and disturbing me. So I will try to keep guys. Hopefully you guys are all seeing me back in, but I'm getting people that are trying to call me while I'm doing the live video, so I apologize. Let's hopefully, if I keep glitching, I'm going to move. So, hello everybody. James, what do you think? I'll talk about salmon. I don't make sure I don't miss it. I'm going to talk about it right now. Sorry. Jack count. I'm going to cover that here right after the hatcheries. Steve, thank you. Larry Phillips, hello. How are you? Big advocate there, Larry, for salmon. Chris Iverson, hi, Chris. Commercial fisherman. Let's see. I might have to move everybody because I am constantly losing service. I apologize. Let's see, Chris. ESA listing should have a time limit. If it doesn't help in 5 years, then delist them. Yeah, that's okay. That's a great one right there, Chris. So let me explain that to everyone. The most important thing you know, that in order to get the winter run delisted, you're going to have to get 10,000 adults back in the Sacramento River for 10 years consecutive, and then they will do a complete reevaluation of that listing petition and then decide whether to downgrade the listing to threatened instead of endangered or to completely delist them completely and then allow you to have access to them. 10 years, 10,000 fish. Guess how many times we've had over 10,000 fish in 30-something years? Like 2 or 3. I mean, it's terrible. I mean, the results are ridiculous. The ESA, we thought, was put into place to protect the species so that you could build it back and then reopen it. But nothing that has been listed in the state of California we've ever got back. We've never got the fishery back. Any of the fisheries. None of them. It's just closed and sorry, no more. And so therefore, from the fishing industry perspective, we are completely opposed to listing our stocks under the California Endangered Species Act or the Endangered Species Act because we've never seen results from the past listings and we've never gained access back. John DeSuze, record numbers in every little creek and canal last couple of years. Correct. Okay, let's talk about that real fast. So yes, you are going to see a lot of salmon in these little creeks. Walnut Creek, Napa Creek, Alameda Creek, Coyote Creek in San Jose, Morgan Hill, down in the South Bay. What happens is we have had such bad river conditions over the last 10 to 15 years that there has been a huge push by ocean advocates to truck our fish from the state and federal hatcheries down to the bay to release them in the bay so that they survive. Because if you put them in the river a lot of times in April and May and June, they're dead. They die. The water temperature's too hot. There's predators, a lot more predators once that water warms and they get more active and it causes a lot of problems. So what happens is that a lot of these fish that have been trucked down to the bay so that they survive, then there's called a stray rate. And a stray rate is when the adult is raised at the American River Hatchery at Nimbus below Folsom Dam and you truck it out and then it doesn't come back to Nimbus Hatchery on the American River, that's called a stray. And it strays to another river. So it might stray to Napa. It strays to a different area. Unless that fish returns to the American Feather Yuba or the Sacramento, then it does not count for escapement in the SI index. And what happened was, for a number of years, is that some of these advocates were saying, oh, well, just truck them, truck all the salmon, and we'll just truck them all. And the reason why is because survival's good. It will give us an ocean fishery, but, you know, at least some of the fish will come back, right? And then the other fish will all stray into the other hatcheries that we need. But that's not what's happening. What's really happening is it's a very small percentage of those fish are actually straying into the hatcheries that we need them to stray into in order to bring the numbers up through the council process in order to keep seasons functioning properly. So hopefully that answers why you're seeing record numbers in little creeks, canals, streams, and everything else. You'll see stuff. There was videos of, 75 dead salmon in a canal in Stockton. Those fish got lost. They went through the maze of the Delta and they got lost. They didn't know where to go and how to get home. And that's very common when you truck fish from certain hatcheries. Not all, certain hatcheries. So we'll talk about that more. Anthony Cox, why are we trying to save the winter run when they clearly can't raise enough to survive, protect the species, and zero economic value to the anglers, especially at the main reason on the flows this year? Great question right there, Anthony Cox. I would say that we need to get to a point to where we are raising more winter run. And for those of you that are below the delta on this call, winter run salmon are what affect your water diversions south of the delta. Winter run is what affects your water diversions north of the delta. It's the number one endangered species on the Sacramento River, and it's the number one species that affects the CVPIA since 1992. Now, the winter run salmon this year, let's just talk numbers. How many came back this year, guys? Remember, I just told you need 10,000 adults for 10 years in order to get delisted. Guess how many came back this year? Less than 800. Less than 800 adult winter run listed ESA, CESA listed salmon. Now, let's talk about those salmon when they come in. Those salmon, winter run fish, as adults, they come through the Golden Gate approximately January-ish, late December, January, February is when they come through. Right now is when they're coming through the Golden Gate. They're pushing all the way up and through, and then they get all the way to Redding, and then they hit their nose right on the Keswick Dam right there at the Keswick Trap, and that's all they can do. So they all get there by February, and then they just sit there and swim like this, and they just sit there. Okay, don't make fun of me and my head nod and my little salmon swim, my little salmon waddle. But this is what they do, and they just sit there like this in front of the dam. From February, March, April, now it's getting hotter, 85-degree weather, the water temperature's rising, okay? May, June, now we have 100-degree weather, okay? The water temperature's rising out of control. And remember, salmon eggs can't get hotter than 56 degrees when they're in the gravel or they die. So what happens is the federal government under ESA gets pressure, the Bureau of Reclamation gets pressure from environmental groups pushing on them saying you have to release the correct amount of water to get that water temperature threshold, okay? And get that temperature below 56 degrees so these salmon live. Okay, now keep in mind, nobody gets to fish for these salmon. Nobody gets to catch these salmon. The only people that can take one of these salmon out of the water, besides a federal employee or state employee to go to the hatchery from the Keswick Trap up below Shasta Dam, the only other people is the Winnemem-Wintu tribe that historically had these fish on their lands prior to Shasta Dam being built in 1930s. And so now they're moving some of these adults up over Shasta Dam and putting them in the McLeod River, where the Winnemem-Wintu tribe is, so that they can swim up there and spawn. And then they're putting traps down below at the tail out of Shasta Lake so that these juveniles can then float down, then capture these juveniles, and then truck them all the way back down to Keswick and let them go. And then they got to go 300 miles out to Rio Vista and then another 45 miles out through the Golden Gate. So that's what's happening with your winter run. Okay. And we'll get into that more here. I'm going to skip. So we're going to talk about how many fish returned next, Steve. And then, but yeah, you guys need to know that you are putting all of our eggs in a basket to save the winter run salmon, which is what is the number one factor that affects all of your water diversions, especially south of the Delta. And we got less than 800 adults back this year. Now, one of the most interesting things, yeah, that's correct, Chris, on the hatchery on the eel. There is a hatchery, they just don't use it, correct. There's also a hatchery on the Mad, and we don't grow Chinook there, and there's a lot of other hatcheries on the coast that were also shut down. That we're not operating, and we're not raising and building fish like we should. If I was in charge of the hatchery, I'd be raising so many salmon. You would have so much salmon. it would be out of control. You would have more salmon than you know what to do with. I think that we could right-side the ship on all the species very quickly. Where there's a will, there's a way. Unfortunately, you have bureaucratic politics on both sides that are doing this, butting heads, causing these issues, fighting these water wars, and the people that pay the price are salmon anglers and the species of salmon.